Yes.
And then you can just indicate when you want her to.
I'll just say next and she can just move it on. Okay.
Yeah.
Firoz, should we then switch our videos off, or what do you think?
You know, since you are the discussants and the speaker, I think you can keep it on unless we develop a problem, but it's up to you also. I mean, so while Rob is speaking, you can mute if you
yeah,
wish.
sure.
Audio at least, but I mean the audio you can keep on so you can see who his interlocutors are. Yeah, I think you can mute the audio. Yeah. And so let's it's time anyway. So let me introduce Dr. Rob Davies, who's our former minister. I don't know if he remembers, but he was on a trip in the US talking to their senior officials and so forth. And you had an event at a university. I can't remember exactly where. I think it was in Washington. And I was in the audience listening to you. I mean, we're really pleased about this book because it's so timely. We really do need to address the challenges and the opportunities that are going to arise in implementing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And of course, we're also looking forward to your observations about the impact of COVID-19. And so I'm very pleased also that Dr. Francisca Suka, who's a colleague in the law school and one of our trade law specialists, agreed to be a discussant for this conversation. I'm looking forward to her engagement with you, Rob. And then, of course, Dr. Regis Sumo, who belongs to the Mandela Institute, is a senior researcher in our institute, and in fact, is also, his speciality is also trade. And he has particular interests in our free trade agreement. And quite strong views, I understand. So I'm looking forward to hearing both of you engage in a discussion with Dr. Rob Davies. Over to you, Rob.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Firoz. And thank you also to the Mandela Institute for this opportunity. I was due to have come and been with you physically back in April, but I think we all know why that didn't happen. So I've prepared a few slides, and obviously since what's happened between April and now is having a profound impact on the global economy and on the national economies of almost every country in the world, I've also included a few observations about some of the issues that are arising in the post-COVID environment. So the title of the presentation is Trade Issues Before and After COVID-19 Towards a Developmental African Continental Free Trade Area. Next, please. So next slide, please. So the objective of the presentation is, well, to offer for discussion some of the ideas that were developed in my book, which is called The Politics of Trade in the Era of Hyperglobalization, a Southern Africa Perspective. And it's available for free online, published by the South Centre at the end of last year. It's available for downloadable for free on their website, which is www.southcentre, or one word, INT. I'm also hoping to situate trade issues and trade policy in a developmental context. And that was the whole objective of writing the book. based on my experience, and I just covered two big trade issues, the WTO processes and the Continental Free Trade Area in the book. But some of the issues are also relevant to other trade negotiations. And then the book is sketching, which I want to just do briefly today, the march from what I called hegemonic multilateralism to what I think is now characterizing the global trading environment, outright mercantilism. And that this was happening already before COVID-19. And then COVID-19 has added some additional dimensions to that, and I will deal with some of those. And then I want to conclude by underscoring the imperative of approaching the construction of the Continental Free Trade Area within a development integration paradigm or perspective. Next slide, please. So I started the book, and I also want to just mention here, I started the book with what I thought was like a trade 101. And I did this because I thought that many of the terms that have got a certain kind of currency and common sense, if you want to call it that, have also become hugely ideologized in the era of neoliberalism, and that they mean things in their implicit meanings way beyond what we understand in common parlance. So take the term trade itself. Trade ministers, as I argue in the book, are presumed by definition to be in favor of trade. But what this means in many of the discussions that one got involved in a multilateral context in particular, is not that you were just in favor of promoting exports of your own country and trying to advance whatever benefited your own country in terms of trade. What it meant was, it meant by definition you were in favor of free trade, and more precisely, you were in favor of trade liberalization in your own environment. So a term even like trade became overladen with ideological overpinnings. And then on top of that as well, I am making the first point that the outcome of trade negotiations generally reflect a balance of power. I'm making this point because there are all sorts of theories of international trade, going back to Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, or ideas more recently of building a competitive advantage. And I'm arguing that trade outcomes don't reflect that. Even in Ricardo's time, one of the major trade patterns that was in existence was the so-called triangular trade of baubles from Europe going to buy slaves in Africa, take the slaves over to the Caribbean and the Americas, and then bring back commodities like cotton, sugar, and so on. And that obviously, the slave trade was nothing to do with a comparative or competitive advantage. It was to do with power. And I'm saying that even in an era where we have more organized and more institutionalized negotiations, the outcomes reflect balance of power. Power which is defined in a number of levels by market power, the size and importance of your market, the relative significance of your markets to the people that you're negotiating with, your own trade strengths, how significant you are as a trader, your institutional strength, because negotiations are between institutional structures, ministries and officials, and whether or not your institutions are actively involved, but not just your governmental institutions, also your key societal players, how strong, how influential are those, the negotiating capacity that arises from that, your ability to be able to push what you want and to argue what you want, and also then your ability to drive a narrative and to sustain and build a narrative, not so much a narrative that's going to inform your own behavior, because that's something which I I've been trying to argue quite strongly in the book, but a narrative which is supposed to influence the behavior of others. And I think that the ideology of neoliberalism was a very good example of that. There was much preaching about what was not practiced, and much practicing about what was not preached. And the positions of governments in trade negotiations, I've argued, were not shaped by broad principles of multilateralism or anything like that, but they were mainly driven by the interests of domestic interest groups who may have offensive or defensive interests, but it's responses to those fundamentally that have really determined positions in the details of trade negotiations. Because one of the points that I have made as well is I think that quite often developing countries won the title, won the battle over the title or the broad stated objective of the negotiation, only to find that when it got to the detailed process, it was something quite else that was shaping this. And then building on the literature that's come from what are called heterodox economists, I've argued that all industrialized countries, all countries that industrialized, defended, nurtured, and protected their nascent industries as they were emerging. But as they became more competitive and as they industrialized, they moved to adopt a more free trade stance. And they did this often to the point of what Friedrich List, the German economist in the 19th century, Ha Jun-chang used that as the title, as one of his books, kicking away the ladder. So denying others the very tools that you yourself used when you industrialize. But this is not something that is across the board, because many Western industrialized countries are highly competitive or became highly competitive in manufacturing and preach free trade in manufacturing. But they were less competitive in agriculture and therefore were often less free trade here. That was one of the big contradictions that emerged in the negotiations in the era of neoliberalism, that there was preaching of free trade and its virtues and autonomous liberalization and whatever applied to manufacturing, but definitely not informing positions of big Western industrialized countries when it came to agriculture. And then I'm arguing that the global crisis, and I'm talking actually the one before the one now, the crisis that really unfolded with the Great Recession of 2007, 8, 9, and also the rise of China. And the rise of China not by following the sort of recommended paths of neoliberalism, but by doing something more like what every other country has done. As it industrialized, as it became more competitive, it opened up more and more. It started opening up fairly gradually in special economic zones, opening up to foreign investors. We fought for trade. But the rise of China, and in fact, the fact that China's emerged as a very significant player, and one which is in this current era of the new fourth industrial revolution, a very significant competitor to the hitherto global hegemon of the US. This has impacted seriously on the traditional positions of some developed countries. So we've seen, and I'll come to this later on, that as China has risen, so we found that countries like the US in particular, but not only the US, have shifted from their free trade positions to actually calling for something much more nuanced and much more protectionist vis-a-vis China in particular. Next slide, please. So briefly to go through the global trade landscape as it looked at on the eve of the COVID-19 health emergency. There was a multilateral trading system encapsulated in the World Trade Organization, which well over 95% of all international trade is now conducted between members of the World Trade Organization operating according to the rules of the World Trade Organization. But the World Trade Organization and the multilateral trading system was in an existential crisis. This was evident in the first instance that the United States had blocked appointments to the appellate body of the World Trade Organization. Now, since most of the disputes in the WTO has a negotiating role, but it also has an enforcement role. And where there are disputes, where there are issues about compliance with the rules, they go to the dispute settlement division of the WTO. And in the end of the day, there's an appellate body. And the appellate body appointments were being blocked by the United States. This meant that by the end of last year, that body was no longer quorate and no longer able to make any rulings in disputes that were taken to the WTO. And this question of blocking those appointments was linked to demands for highly partisan, what are called reforms of the WTO. And it was said that there were too many developing countries. China was first in the frame, but it was not the only one. There was a list of countries, and we were in the list as well, towards the bottom, if you like, but still in the list. It was said that developing countries that were of a certain size and strength were cheating by calling for special differential treatment that was less than full reciprocity and particular rights in negotiations and in outcomes, and that we should all be accepting something close to full reciprocity in any trade negotiations, meaning that whatever we get from you, we have to give back to you the same. There shouldn't be anything less than that, and there should also be tightening up of rules to curtail policy space on issues like industrial subsidies or state-owned enterprises. And the US Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, explained the way that the position on the appellate body was linked to this in a testimony to the Senate Finance Committee last year. And he said, I know of no other way to push for WTO reform than to use the only leverage available to the United States by blocking the appointment of appellate body members. In other words, the US is not making a short-term gesture because of a few rulings, because that was what they first came in on, although many rulings go in their favor. They're calling for fundamental changes. And this WTO reform agenda has ended up being backed. Well, that was the Trump administration, and there was some unhappiness about this originally by some developed countries, but many developed countries and even some developing countries have been saying that this is, to use the words of the G20 sometimes, the necessary reform of the WTO. Then part of the trade landscape was that you had the start of trade wars. And this began when the Trump administration imposed tariffs which were raised above the WTO binding levels or above, in violation of bilateral arrangements that they had. They raised them under Section 232 of their own trade law in the name of national security. And these were raised against us, among others, on steel and aluminium products. There were threats to do the same on automotive products and others. But I think we've seen, as time's gone on, to use the terminology of UNCTAD in its trade development report, there's been a move from tariff tantrums to technology turbulence. That the real issue behind the deployment of this kind of unilateralism is not so much unhappiness about steel and aluminium imports, although that is part of it. Actually, it is that there is real concern that a country like China is becoming more competitive than the United States in the rollout of 5G technology. And so I think we've seen a whole series of measures to try to assert mastery over digital technology and to try to block China from outcompeting the US in this area. We've also seen with the declining currency of the multilateral process, we've seen the emergence of a series of initiatives aimed at establishing plurilaterals in which groups of like-minded countries would get together to seek various rules. And the one multilateral rule that the developed world seems to have an interest in are rules on e-commerce, electronic commerce. And these are based on something called the Digital 2 Dozen. And it's got a huge echo of the kind of demands that were put about financial sectors, basically light touch regulation, no demands, no requirements for source codes, no localization, no taxation on electronic transactions and things like that. And then a very clear preference has been evinced by the United States that it wants to have bilateral agreements, and that even includes, by the way, when they did come to South Africa in the past, they weren't interested in the fact that South Africa was part of a customs union with Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini, and that we would have to negotiate as a group. They wanted to have a negotiation with South Africa, which I mean, up to now we've refused to participate in. So the first question I'm raising, how did we get there? How do we get to this point of this existential crisis for the multilateral trading system, which was part of the reality even before COVID-19? I see you've changed the slide. Good. We got there because we had a move from what I call hegemonic multilateralism. We had a huge building of what I call in the book a behemoth around the WTO at the end of the Uruguay round, which took place from 1983 and was concluded 1993 and gave rise to the Marrakesh Agreement of 1994, right at the time of our own transition. And this is the round which has set the existing rules of the multilateral system. And the Uruguay round was conducted through what was called the principal supplier-led process. This is the terminology that Faisal Ismail in his PhD unpacks. And the whole idea was that under the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which was the body that gave way to the WTO after the Uruguay round, but which conducted the negotiations at the time, the idea was that there were too many members to have a serious negotiation among all of them. And so you took the principal suppliers. Those were the largest economies. They went into something called green rooms, which was named after a room in the building in Geneva. And they cracked the deal among themselves. And then the deal was basically, as it were, sold to everybody else. And the Uruguay round, South Africa, by the way, for most of this round, it was the apartheid government that participated in it. Again, Faisal's thesis shows that for much of the time, the apartheid government didn't want to raise its head too much above the parapet. Otherwise, someone would raise the question of throwing them out of the organization. They also had the arrogance to declare South Africa a developed country. So with the exception of a few concessions that were rung at the last minute with a phone call from Madiba, who was not yet president of the country, to Bill Clinton, but he was speaking on behalf of something called the National Economic Council, which was a body just on the eve of the transition. He got a bit of a carve out for the automotive sector and the clothing textile sector, but otherwise South Africa took the cuts of the developed world, which means that we actually took on more rigorous cuts in most industrial tariffs than the likes of Brazil and India. And the Uruguay round unleashed the most ambitious cuts in industrial tariffs. But it did not deal with very significant cuts in industrial tariffs took place, big liberalization. I think we know by now in South Africa that this had a major impact on our industrial capability and capacity. But the Uruguay round did not deal with the issue of subsidies on agricultural products, nor on the very high tariffs that continue to exist on agricultural tariffs. And these were largely postponed to a built-in agenda of a future round, which was also intended in the built-in agenda to deal with trade in services. So the Marrakesh Agreement became a major driver of what I think people are now calling hyper-globalization of the 90s, which saw widespread tariff liberalization, financialization, which I think is something we really need to understand, where I think one way of putting it was I read some, I think it was one of the UNCTAD reports that said banking stopped being boring. When it stopped being boring, it also stopped serving the needs of the productive economy, and it ended up turning financial products into securities and into other derivatives which were traded among financial institutions with increasing distance from the real economy, huge fortunes made in speculative activities, and this was something that took place under the rubric of light touch regulation. I think we all know that came unstuck badly in the global financial crisis. There was also the establishment of global networks facilitated by ICT technology, the third industrial revolution, to use those terms. And all of this was the United Nations Development Program, 1996, I think it was. They said that globalization was both a description of real things happening in economies, such as the ones I mentioned as well, but also of a prescription, a narrative of neoliberalism emerging in the context of post-Cold War triumphalism, that there was only one pathway for all, as one book which was much read at the time called The Lexus and the Olive Tree put it, you had to put on the golden straitjacket of neoliberal policies, of budget discipline, of privatization and so on. And if you put on that golden straitjacket, then you could aspire to the world of the Lexus, the luxury motor car. If you refused, you would be confined to lower level activities of the world of the olive tree. But developing countries entered the system based on principles of less and full reciprocity, on special differential treatment, on consensus-based decision-making, and what was called a single undertaking, meaning nothing's agreed till everything's agreed, that all issues had to be agreed before there was some kind of a conclusion. Then the next slide, please. Along the way, and I don't mention this here, but there was a very specific set of conditions in 2001, which gave rise to a Doha development mandate, which was to inform a round of negotiations. Now, what happened here was that the 1999 ministerial in Seattle collapsed. The ministerial conference collapsed. And it collapsed. There were two dynamics. First of all, the conference was delayed for at least a day by demonstrations taking place outside in what was quite well known as the Battle of Seattle. But inside the conference at the same time, you had a number of delegations challenging the green room principles, and kind of one of the incidents that happened there was that a number of African countries went and banged on the door of the green room where a meeting was taking place, demanding to be let in. And when the meeting collapsed without any agreement, there was an undertaking that there would be more democracy in the process, and also that this happened in the aftermath of 9/11, the Doha round, and just after the dot-com crisis. And it was kind of a unique moment in which developing countries were able to secure a number of gains, but particularly in the declaratory statements of the ministerial declaration. And this declaration, which actually remains the only formal mandate for negotiations in the WTO at the moment even. It says the majority of WTO members are developing countries. We seek to place their needs and interests at the heart of the work program adopted in this declaration. And then it said that the issue of agriculture, which was an issue of very great significance for developing countries, there would be comprehensive negotiations aimed at substantial improvements in market access, reductions with a view to phasing out all forms of export subsidies and substantial reductions of trade distorting domestic support. So I think it's just note there that export subsidies are subsidies directly on exports. They were to be phased out, but not all other forms of domestic support, not all other subsidies, which also had an impact on trade, only substantial reductions. There was also a very important declaration on trips and public health, which I think in the light of the COVID-19 becomes very, very significant, that without declaring a formal health emergency, developing countries were able to resort to a whole lot of things like parallel imports and compulsory licenses and things like that. It's something that South Africa pioneered, but we've not resorted to it because the Department of Health has managed to use that as a bit of a sword to try to force some kind of agreements with pharmaceutical companies. Then, as I said already, in the mandate itself, to go to the next slide, the impasse in the round continued. There were many devils in the detail. So the declaration, it's a development round. The developing countries are going to call the shots. So the one devil in the detail was that trade distorting domestic support was to be reduced and not eliminated. So our outcome was still to leave in place a high level of domestic support programs which were acknowledged to be trade distorting to the disadvantage of developing countries. Then in non-agricultural market access or industrial tariffs, these were supposed to target tariff peaks and escalations and non-tariff barriers on products of export interest to developing countries. That's all good because many of the tariffs in developed countries, you had on industrial products, the overall average tariff was fairly low. But where there was a competitive product like clothing and textiles, then suddenly it would go up. That's called a tariff peak. And escalations, and those apply to, well, if you export your raw food, that's fine. You process it and you turn it into a higher value added product, then there's a higher duty. But the declaration said, not only would it be tariff peaks and escalations and non-tariff barriers on products of export interest to developing countries, but also high tariffs generally. And that was then turned into a formula. I was actually a minor member of our delegation at the time, and I tried to fight to get I could see what was going to happen, to get the high tariffs generally out, but unfortunately, we didn't manage to prevail. So the detailed processes that took place thereafter, this was the problem. They saw major imbalances. The text that emerged on agriculture was a very long phone book type document, which would have implemented modest reforms. And there were many carve-outs for many sensitivities in developed countries on agriculture. But the one on NAMA was one size fits all with a formula that would have required big cuts by formula-taking developing countries, including South Africa. And then there was an issue of what was called sectorals, that beyond what you did with your tariff cuts through the formula, you were supposed to engage in sectorals on certain product lines, and then you would have to cut them yet further. And so there was this package. I think many in the developing world argued it was imbalanced. It couldn't command consensus, and it led to an impasse in the Doha round in 2008. And that led to a long period of calling for the conclusion and then finally moving from a process which was supposed to be a single undertaking with all issues on the table, and until all issues are finalized, nothing would be agreed, into small packages. And the main one which did go through was one on trade facilitation. This one went through in 2013. It was to do with customs administration, transparency, which means that you had to show that when you made rules about passing through your ports and so on, you had to offer opportunities to interested parties to be heard. This was supposed to have delivered $1 trillion of new value, much of it going to developing countries. But I asked a question there, we've seen it, and the answer I think is fairly obvious. So this impasse plus the onset of the global economic crisis led to a shift in the focus by developed countries. They went in, first of all, this is before the Trump administration, to mega regionals, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the one with the Transatlantic one as well. These were what were called high-quality 21st century agreements. They were characterized by very little differentiation. There was to be no difference between what the United States received and what any other country that participated would receive. There was also supposed to be what were called trade-related obligations on things like investment, giving investors, individual investors, a large scope to challenge government policy in a whole range of areas, on intellectual property, which was supposed to be a higher standard than within the WTO, on competition, on electronic commerce. And eventually you saw that the United States, and again, also before the Trump administration, challenging the idea of the Doha mandate, and even then the idea that development should have any role in informing trade. So the next slide, please. So I say, what happened as a result of this? Well, hyperglobalization led to an increase in trade, for sure. It led to the formation of global value chains. This is globalization. Global value chains were that you saw more and more trade in intermediate products, where a product like a motor car, hard to say it was a product of a particular country because many of the components came from other countries. And there were global value chains emerging in many sectors and areas. And sometimes the issue was put that, you know, developing countries need to get into the global value chains. And I've argued that it wasn't that developing countries were outside of the value chains, but they was definitely part of them, but they were integrated in them in the least lucrative part of the value chain as producers and exporters of raw materials. So there have been studies over the time. I mentioned one in the book that coffee from Africa. Africa produces and exports coffee. It's around $6 billion US dollars that African countries get from exporting coffee. But that's turned into products outside of Africa that are over 100 billion. In other words, from the production of a product which doesn't undergo that much physical transformation outside, value addition of 95% is taking place, and that value doesn't go to Africa. And if you come to a product like a cell phone, I looked once the iPhone 6, the value of the raw materials, the mining products and the metals and the other things that are in it is less than 1% of the final price of the product. The other thing was financialization. I already mentioned that. We saw plenty of that. We saw what are called winner takes most markets, that there were, through globalization, consumers had access to products from virtually anywhere. Those that were able to produce on a global scale captured more or less the whole market, and the runners-up and other players captured very little. And so there was a huge sort of win for those who won, and those that lost badly. And this was associated with widening inequality. The richest few dozen in the world were having more wealth than the poorest half. The share of wages in GDP declined in both developing and developed countries. Middle classes in the developed as well as the developing world were under pressure. And China's emergence as an industrial power, which was a significant feature of this as well. But it achieved this through a strategic liberalization, calibrated according to the stages of its industrial policy, which was a vastly different path from that recommended by neoliberalism. And the narrative of China in the developed world changed dramatically over time. So as China was rising and developing, it was held out as a success story of globalization. And without really understanding the development path of China by saying that, well, it's happening at the time of trade opening, so therefore it's due to the trade opening. And then later on, China became categorized as an abuser of global trade rules. And the kicking away of the ladder is taking place not by China, but by its rivals. So any of our abilities to follow China are being kicked away by demands for rules that would curtail China, but would also curtail the rest of us. It's not so much China that's demanding the rules that would kick away the ladder, it's its competitors and rivals. Next one, please. So then I trace in the chapters on the global environment, we had the rise of nationalistic populism in the developed world, and particularly in the United States. The cause of this was the inequality, the growing economic insecurity, even for middle classes, as I said. I think that's very important. And then I think particularly after the financial crisis, diminishing respect for mainstream advice and neoliberal ideology with economists and experts of all sorts being seen to have less and less respect. I think this is also reflected in things like Brexit votes and stuff like that. And in the US, we had a sense of multilateralism, which had been driven by the US to a very high degree when it was in charge, but now a sense that multilateralism had disadvantaged the US, a preference for bilateralism over multilateralism or regionalism, the use of national security justified measures to entrench first mover advantage and ward off competitive challenges from emerging economies, and then to seek adjustment to multilateral rules, which I've already mentioned. So that's the context there. Next one. I've also dealt with this, and I won't go into it in much detail. So reform of the system for partisan advantage, not reform of the system in any sense with any narrative that says this is for the common good. This has been driven by a sense that the biggest and strongest economy in the world has been disadvantaged. So it's seeking an undermining of differentiation, a reduction of policy space. Every new challenge in the past has been seen to require new free trade rule. This was the case of environmental goods, and although there's much less interest in that now, but it's also the case in e-commerce, where you wouldn't be allowed to localization or any kind of demands for source codes or data sovereignty would be challenged. That's the idea, is to try to put in place some kind of rules on electronic commerce. That's the digital 2 dozen. I'm saying that I think we need to think long-term about this, because you may think that we're not using some of these measures up to now. And I think that it's very, very important that we don't base positions on that we do think into the long term, because if we say, okay, we're not using it now, therefore we can sign it away and not going to hurt us, in the longer term, as these technologies unfold, they could have very significant implications. I'm just giving one, that the Internet of Things, that will become much more common with 5G technology. You'll have digital transactions that will send messages to 3D printers from some centralized source that will include the manufacturing of industrial components. And these will be, if there is no taxes on digital transactions, that will be entering duty-free, and that will be free trade in industrial products, which may have very serious implications for industrialization efforts. We need to ensure that we don't sign away space and entrench the advantages of the first movers in these technologies. So I'm saying that was the view of that was how the environment looked. But there was an alternative beginning to emerge in the developing world. And the way we put it in some of the discussions I was involved in is to say, well, yes, we do need to reform the system. The system is not ideal, but we need reform for development and inclusivity. We need a multilateralism now more than ever. Globalism is a reality, but many challenges that it poses require cooperation. And the defense of multilateralism doesn't mean that we have to defend the status quo or accept unfair reforms that will skew the imbalances even more. And that we also need to be aware that if there's a reform agenda that skews imbalances against us in one institution, that may well impact on others. For example, what happens in climate change is very closely linked to what happens in trade both ways. And that we therefore need to define our own approach. And one of the lessons of economic policy is that active industrial policy is critical if you want to break out of this place in global value chains or the global division of labor as mere suppliers of primary unprocessed products. Then I'm saying there was a movement for a global Green New Deal. I think that this is something which I've been arguing quite strongly in a number of fora. It's quite critical that we think about this because there is this movement now. It's talked about there being fragile global growth, trade tensions, growing inequality, falling labor shares, erosion of public spending with austerity programs, weak investment growth, and a growing stock of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and that we need to move beyond austerity from financialization to make finance work for all. And the Global Green New Deal has envisaged investment in industrial policy, in a green transition, and in international coordination. Part of this is something called Geneva Principles on Trade. They say that global rules should be calibrated towards the overarching goals of social and economic sustainability, of shared prosperity and environmental sustainability, and be protected against capture by the most powerful players. States share common but differentiated responsibilities in a multilateral system built to advance global public rules and protect the global commons. And the right of states to pursue, to policy space to pursue national development should be enshrined in global rules. And then they go on, next slide. Global regulation should be designed both to strengthen a dynamic international division of labor and prevent destructive unilateral economic actions. And global public institutions must be accountable to their full membership, open to a diversity of viewpoints and cognizant of new voices, and have balanced dispute systems. So that's just an indication of some of the challenges and alternatives that had begun to emerge. The next slide, I'm just saying, what impact on this environment has COVID-19 had? And the first and probably least important is that it's led to a postponement of the WTO ministerial that was supposed to have happened next month. That's been postponed until 2021. And also the Director General, Roberto Azevedo, has stepped down, says he will not be at that conference. And so there's now a process of electing a new Director General. So that's the first thing it's done. Secondly, what we were talking about before we started, it's revealed a huge underpreparedness across the world for a predictable and predicted health emergency, manifested in, among other things, shortages across the world of medical equipment, particularly medical equipment for frontline personnel and things like that. Lockdowns disrupted global supply lines and rendered vulnerable countries dependent on imports of essential goods, including foodstuffs. And several countries violated all the rules by imposing and import bans, diverting health products. We saw that on a number of occasions. There was an American company, I think it was the 3M company, that was producing masks, and those masks were supposed to go to Europe, and they were diverted. They were manufactured in Singapore. They were diverted to the United States. We've seen even individual EU countries have not allowed their products to go to other EU countries. So we've seen that there have been, when the chips are down, the global supply line issue doesn't operate, and that what countries have been told before, well, don't think you should manufacture everything in your own country, rather allow other supply lines to take over, and you focus on a few things. Well, when it comes to things like fundamental products required in a health emergency, foodstuffs as well as medical equipment, that has been shown to be not particularly viable. And this is fueled, what I think is a highly partisan discourse on what's called shortening of supply lines and localizing production of essential products. So you're now getting an increasing, but it's not saying the world must do it. Every country in the world must do it. It's saying we will now ensure that we are not dependent on outside supplies. We will use any tool at our disposal to ensure that we are self-sufficient in important medical equipment and also in foodstuffs and other what might be considered emergency equipment. And I said, this is articulated, the next slide, please. This is articulated most strongly in the US, where the pandemic has also intensified the anti-China rhetoric. So I pointed out that the anti-China rhetoric was already there. Now it's even stronger as a result of the pandemic. Of course, we've seen China being blamed for the pandemic. And this is a quote from Robert Lighthizer again, the US Trade Representative, at a webinar that he participated in. The report was on June the 4th, this month earlier. And he said, we need a policy, be it subsidies or tariffs or whatever it takes. We have to have an industrial policy so that we never find ourselves not independent on material that is really important to the country. So he's saying we're going to use anything, industrial policy, subsidies, tariffs, whatever it takes to ensure that we are self-sufficient in things that are really important to the country. Now, I say it's highly partisan because in the very same webinar, he called for reform of the WTO and the lines I've already mentioned, and also for what he called a high-quality trade deal, which means less asymmetry than EU economic partnership agreements. And he actually said that these ones are not particularly good with African countries, and also wanted more trade-related policy commitments within African countries. So he says that it's not that it is that all of us must become more self-sufficient in critical products. It is that we will be more sufficient, and at the same time, we want you to enter into high-quality agreements in which you open up at the same level as we open up towards you. So I'm saying it's, I'm using a bit of a trick here that there's the US in capitals and there's US in small. So there's one law for the US and another law for us. I think that's the way it is. And I think the challenge that we've got under these circumstances where the hypocrisy is actually plain for all to see is, and I'm paraphrasing what a congressman in the United States said when Britain was preaching free trade to the United States as it was industrializing in the years immediately after the Civil War. I'm saying, can Africa actually turn around and say, we will do as the United States does and not as the United States says? I think that might be something that could be an important lesson from us. So let me turn then, because the second part was the African Continental Free Trade Area, because I think that in an incredibly turbulent and unfriendly environment for developing countries, the African Continental FTA does offer a potential alternative. So I'm turning to that now. Now, where are we? The Continental FTA is now ratified. The agreements are all ratified, and the agreement is legally or theoretically in force, but COVID-19 has delayed the program of operationalization. The tariff cut commitments were supposed to have been implemented this year, but now because of the COVID, that has been delayed. But the secretariat that is to guide the Continental Free Trade Area has been in place since April, and this is headed by Wamkeli Meni, who's a South African, but he also was an official in the Department of Trade and Industry, and in fact was South Africa's lead negotiator in the continental FTA negotiations, which is where he built the record that got him elected into that position. Now, when we come to the continental FTA, I argue that in the book that the broadening of integration across existing regional communities is actually correct and is desirable and is potentially something that could help the continent of Africa to rise beyond its place in the global division of labor as producer and exporter of primary products. And actually, it emerged after quite a lot of debates. I trace one of them in the book, the debates in SADC, because there were ideas that actually SADC should be deepened, that the free trade area in SADC should be moving into a customs union, an economic union, into a monetary union. All of that should happen in a very, very short space of time. And through those debates, actually, we came to the idea that that's not where we need to be going. We need to be going towards broadening integration, creating a large African regional market that will actually be able to sustain economic diversification and support industrialization. And this all coincided with a change as well, where because of some of the processes I've mentioned earlier, countries that industrialized, those few that industrialized, and did so by exporting manufactured goods to the developed world, starting maybe with the newly industrializing economies of East Asia in the 1970s, but later, more recently, China, they started industrializing by exporting finished goods to the US, the EU, and others. But actually, in the light of the global crisis, that market became less and less growing, and also, well, there was backlashes that we were beginning to see, and I mentioned a number of these. And so those countries have all turned to trying to move up the value chain and support consumer demand in their own countries. But they've got large populations. China, India have all got large populations, or put another way, colonialism didn't divide them into 54 different countries. As Africa, we have the numbers at continental level that could support broad industrialization. But I say that there are conflicting paradigms that are actually underpinning the consensus that we have about the desirability of broadening broadening integration. And these different paradigms are conventional trade integration. The idea that we must move incrementally and quickly towards a formal trade integration arrangement based on models that exist in countries that have got high levels of complementarity, that perhaps inform the European Union integration process, where we move from free trade areas to quickly to customs unions, to common markets, and so on. That follow in this ladder of integration, when the conditions on the ground manifestly are not the same, that this is a trap that would probably lead to a few countries that can produce finished goods and export them to the rest of the continent benefiting, the others not, which will most likely lead to demands to change rules of origin so that much lower levels of processing are allowed, and the main beneficiaries could well become countries which are outside the region supplying goods which are screwdriver added to only in the continent. The other one is a version of that which was open regionalism, which was wanted to see that any trade liberalization which takes place within a region becomes a lever towards trade liberalization to the rest of the world. And again, I say that if that happened, what would happen would be that the main beneficiaries of the regional integration process would be extra-regional suppliers and not African countries. And then the third paradigm, next slide please, development integration. Now, this is a perspective which has been developing over the years, and it basically argues that in developing country regions, the main barriers to increasing intra-regional trade are often not tariffs. It's not because the tariffs are so high between Niger and Burkina Faso, but there's a low level of inter-regional trade. The low level of trade between those two countries is much more linked to the fact that they have underdeveloped production structures, that they're not producing what their own people consume, much less what the next door country's people consume. And also there's probably inadequate infrastructure, that it's easier to get the goods in from Europe than it is to get the goods into the next door country. And as I said earlier, it's not that African countries are not integrated into global value chains. They are, but they are integrated as producers and exporters of primary commodities, which is the least lucrative place to be. And then the next point I'm making is that the Continental FTA, here are some of the figures, with 1.2 billion people and $2.3 trillion of combined GDP, that this is a large regional market. And I'm saying that the integration in this large regional market, the establishment of the Continental Free Trade Area, the real prize from this is not just that it would increase inter-regional trade from the modest levels it is now, but that it would actually lead to the creation of regional value chains that would support higher value-added production across swathes of the continent, and change not just the quantity of inter-regional trade, not just create more inter-regional trade, but also change the quality of that trade, trade in more intermediate products, that you would have more products emerging with inputs coming from several African countries, that these would be higher value-added products supplied to African consumers and eventually probably also exported. Now, the elements of such a program would be that, next slide, please, the next slide. Yeah, that you'd need asymmetrical trade integration to cater for the uneven development of countries of the continent. That hasn't been built in sufficiently, in my view, into the architecture of the Continental FTA. But if you expect countries like Egypt and South Africa to undertake exactly the same level of integration as Niger and Burkina Faso, I think you can see that there is a problem, that even if those countries are not using tariffs as tools of supporting their own industries, they are using them as means of raising revenue. And so what we did in the SADC FTA was to build more asymmetry into it. The bigger economies undertake bigger liberalization than the smaller. But that there should also be cooperation to promote structural transformation and transformative industrialization, including the creation of regional value chains. Now, this would then build a robust regional market to unlock the continent's manufacturing potential. Cooperation on cross-border infrastructure and investment, as well as trade facilitation, and cooperation to promote democracy, good governance, peace and security, which are obviously important additional elements. Now, the next slide, please. Yeah. I'm saying that the COVID health emergency, as well as the existence of extreme weather events, and if I just pause here and say that 2016 was the hottest year on record, and the 5 years up to 2019 were the 5 hottest years on record. And each of those has been linked to a series of localized extreme weather emergencies. They've been linked to issues of floods, more cyclones, more damaging cyclones, and those sorts of things. High hurricanes. We see some of those beginning to emerge in KwaZulu-Natal. But at the other end, droughts and challenges associated with droughts, food insecurity, and so on. And I'm saying that even if we do eventually manage, and this is a big if, we do manage to get some kind of understanding of a sufficiently ambitious program of mitigation, we are nevertheless going to have to adapt to the reality of extreme weather events. And I'm saying that the COVID emergency and the imperative to adapt to those challenges is something that I think we really do need to build in. And that will include that we need to build greater resilience in our health services, greater resilience on much of the infrastructure that we build. I mean, if we build some railway line and it gets washed away, it's not much use. So we need to build greater resilience into traditional infrastructure. We also need to address things like the conditions of social conditions of people, and build much, if we have we've all seen that COVID-19, the social distancing and hand washing, obvious good practice, has been undermined greatly if you have overcrowding in shack accommodation with inadequate water supply. So one of the things is that in the continental level, the imperative to build greater resilience and also to shorten supply lines, because we are, I think, are going to see great disappointment when and if a vaccine for COVID-19 emerges. Africa will most likely be way back in the queue. There are already indications that some research companies have been receiving grants on condition that they're supplied first to the US. So when we get to get those, that's something that remains to be seen. But not just on that, but in the light of all the things that happened with ventilators, with personal protective equipment and so on, as well as with the development of all kinds of pharmaceutical products, that imperative should underpin something which the continent has been talking about for quite a while, building capacity to produce pharmaceuticals and medical equipment and to achieve greater food security. And these imperatives, among others, could lead to the emergence of regional value chains. And the ideas, I'm saying, of the Global Green New Deal, and the imperative to secure policy space, I'm arguing, must inform the continent's engagements with the rest of the world. We can't be building a continental free trade area that's going to support industrialization on the continent if at the same time we enter into an agreement with the United States of the sort which Lighthizer was talking about. That will just simply mean that anything we try to do to shorten value chains to support industrialization are going to be undermined by the commitments we make in those. So what I'm saying, and to conclude then, is I think there's a historic opportunity to calibrate now the African continental free trade area. Perhaps more of an opportunity, more of an awareness about some of these issues in the light of COVID and the delays that it's created. And that if we work purposefully and in the right way, we need to be able to calibrate this continental FTA to underpin a program for inclusive development and industrialization on the continent. So those were the points I wanted to make. Let me stop there and
we lost you, Rob.
No, I said I'm finished. Okay. I said thank you very much for your attention. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. It's a lot to chew on. Very, very comprehensive. And it raises a whole lot of issues. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. Let me at this point also welcome all our participants. There are 43, so the advert actually for reasons which I'm not going to go into, only really went out this morning. So it's great. And a lot of people are not participating with the law school, Rob, because, or from the academy, because the interviews for the new Vice Chancellor are taking place at the same time, which of course we didn't know when we scheduled this event. But now it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Francisca Suka, who's a trade law specialist in the Wits Law School. to ask questions, make comments. Please feel free, Francisca, to from a time point of view, to take your time, and then after you, I'm going to call on Regis, but we'll start with you.
Thanks, Firoz, for that opportunity. I, of course, tried to make it short because we had already heard now in our very interesting perspectives, and there are a lot of other participants whom I also like to hear the views. So you said already that a lot of things were touched, so it's very difficult to pick and choose now here what to comment on. But I would like to first say that thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today, and also in the book. It really provides us with a lot of insights into the South African approach to trade negotiations. And I'm saying that because a few things we of course know or knew, and others we understand now better. And that I'm saying because among trade experts, it very often looks like South Africa simply blocks everything in Geneva, or at least new things, the so-called pressing issues in the 21st century, very often together with India, but we also know that it's a bit more nuanced than this, and this book contributes to giving there a bit more understanding. So I'm very pleased about the book. The first one major comment I would like to make with regards to one of your main points, and that was multilateralism more than ever. And I could not agree more, let me say it that way, because everything is global and connected, and no country could be economically strong alone, in my opinion. But my question goes into the reality of that wish for multilateralism in that crisis. And you said the appellate body is in crisis, trade was, and it was already before, and it will probably just get worse. One of the US senators in May has now introduced a joint resolution to maybe even withdraw from the US. It probably will not happen because we had the threats before, but that was as a response to the MPIA, so the new arbitration system. So countries will probably be under more pressure because of economic decline. So my question in terms of the multilateralism and its the realistic approach goes to how do we have multilateralism when we want to preserve the consensus principle? So, and I understand South Africa does follow that still because they confirmed it in the July package in 2019. So having that consensus, how is that compatible with continuing with multilateralism if we not revisit the understanding of consensus? So perhaps differentiate a bit from unanimity or accepting higher majorities, those kind of things. Which would lead me to the question, if we don't change the understanding of consensus or the need for that, is that not really the logical consequence that we enter into so much more plurilateral approaches, what we already see? And that is, at least how I understood the South African government, what the South Africa exactly doesn't want, this proliferation of plurilateral agreements. And at the same time, COVID has now somehow shown several states that come together and cooperate regarding food, regarding PPAs. So again, a plurilateral approach of cooperation, or even a move to a critical mass agreement, or at least a wish to be able to include it into the WTO was also voiced, and with regards to medical equipment. So I think what I'm saying is the current rules do not allow any of those plurilateral approaches to be incorporated into the WTO, also because of the consensus requirement, or at least a 2/3 majority. That would be my first point regarding consensus and compatibility of multilateral approach. My second point would go very clearly to the understanding of the position of the South African government regarding digital trade. And the digital agenda was approached quite often also in the presentation, rightfully so, because I think it's a very important point and very important movement for the future. And I say digital trade, not e-commerce, because e-commerce always just captures one very little aspect of digital trade. My understanding so far is that South Africa did stay away from those negotiations, multilateral and plurilateral, because of the non-completion of the Doha round issues, and wishes to prioritize the new issues as much as the old, which I fully understand. And also I think earlier in the presentation was mentioned the digital 2000s, or let us say there are already standards and they are used usually in those negotiations. My question now is, with COVID, everything has a little bit changed. We have seen now extreme acceleration of digital solutions that had to be used, and at the same time an extreme divide, digital divide between countries and also within. And that will not so much change probably after COVID. In other words, not all will stay there, but not so much will revert. So we will have that need, and if we have an economic, if we want to tap into digital opportunities for Africa, then we have to also kind of approach that. So the question would be, has then the approach now, or will the approach, you might not know that because, but you have probably still contact to your colleagues, will the approach for South Africa regarding those negotiations change? Would they perhaps consider to contribute or shape the negotiations at multilateral or plurilateral level? Other African countries do that already. Kenya, Nigeria are 2 of the 6. Or could also an alternative be, and that's what I was asking, to maybe test it first in the AfCFTA now, where there are also already e-commerce talks. So to tap, like in that potential what was mentioned of using the AfCFTA as a test run for potential digital trade rules, which then could kind of explore the things you mentioned. It could be digital tax explored for digital transactions. France has already done that at the outrage of the US. Data localization, so that it can, I mean, the idea that data is used for your own citizens and not by the foreign companies. Access to source codes, you have mentioned that, but also accommodating high level of concentration of some big techs. Small special differential treatment could be included because within Africa's extreme digital divide, and long-term thoughts that you had on Internet of Things could be included, the industrial components in the 4th industrial resolution, and also the IP and cybersecurity thing. So my question would go to what would you see as the South African approach, what they will do and what should they do, which are also 2 different things. Where I can't spare a comment that on a regional level, it's also interesting what position South Africa should take, because here they are one of the leaders in the digital industry, so might have a similar situation like on a global level. Okay, 2 smaller points to the general impact on COVID that was mentioned, that there will be probably a change of countries looking more protectionist, more inward. And then it was mentioned that we don't want to be dependent mainly by the US. We don't want to be dependent with regards to those imports anymore. Is that at all possible? So I doubt it a bit because of all the connections of the value chains, even those big exporters, and that is China, Germany, US, of those materials that we looked at are dependent on other countries with those inputs. So I don't think that it's really an option for the US to do that. And that leads into the question, because of all the measures that the US then probably will take, or also other countries, of distorting subsidies and preventing imports. What kind of trade policy do you think we continue with? What are we steering towards? You explained the system of hegemonic multilateralism to outright mercantilism. What do you think are we looking at now? Are we going back to hegemonism? That I can't see that. A social market economy would be nice. I doubt it a bit. But what kind of policy system do you think we're steering to? Would be the question. One that probed with regards to your comments about general inequality that that increases, and we know that it does, which is interesting because we say general inequality between countries, but we're living here in a country that has the highest inequality according to the World Bank list between the richest and the poorest. So maybe we should also think about what we criticize in terms of the global economic system, and look at our own domestic market system, and what we can learn from our critique on the global system might also apply already within. That was just an additional thought that came up whilst you were speaking. Also, with a little bit of on a lighter note and smile, was a thought when you spoke about the DG, and that a new DG has to be elected now before the new ministerial conference. How interesting would it be if it would be an African woman? And there are a couple in the run. Amina Mohammed is one, and Nigerian, I can't pronounce the name properly. Thinking about the COVID and how states have handled COVID, we read it a couple of times that all countries where women led the countries did actually better. So would it not be a wise solution for the DG being an African woman? That at the end of what I'm saying, because I spare my thoughts on developmental integration, I mostly agree with you on that, but I know that Regis has a couple of more thoughts on that and would like to just hand over to Regis. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you, Francesca. There was a lot there, so I was initially inclined to think, well, Rob might want to respond. What do you think, Regis? Do you think we should just continue the conversation and then get Rob to respond? Let me just indicate to all the other participants that once we've done with this round, because I see Anthony has asked a question in the chat forum, I will open it up for questions. And at that point, you can unmute, ask your question, and then mute again. And I'll give, so that Rob can respond. Regis, what do you think? Do you think let's wanna go with continue from Francesca, or do you feel that they are different issues and you'd like to come in after Rob responds to Francesca?
I think it's Rob's choice, basically, if he wants to take all the comments at once, or whether he wants to react to Francesca's first. I don't know. I'm happy with his.
Either
so
way.
let me suggest that why don't we have Francesca and Regis? I can manage that lot, and then we'll do the others in another round. Okay. Yeah.
Please go for it.
Okay. Yes. Like Francesca has mentioned earlier on, there were a lot of things that were mentioned and very interesting issues to discuss. I won't take long, but I don't know whether it will take long. I would first like to address the issue of COVID and how it relates to how it can shape or reshape the rules of on trade issues in the African context. For instance, we observe that in the European Union, for instance, even though members initially imposed export restrictions, the European Commission later on issued a regulation to actually kind of revoke all these individual countries' measures. In the African context, we didn't have this kind of continental or regional, even at the regional level. We didn't have something that could match that kind of implication, but at the supranational level. So my question was basically to ask, and also to question whether the fact that African countries have actually used this opportunity whether African countries can use this opportunity to reshape the AfCFTA rule on export restriction, for instance, by somehow making it possible for one country to discriminate against other countries without violating WTO rules, for instance. Because let me put it this way. Because the WTO rule says this: if you are going to impose an export restriction, it has to be on an MFN basis. And my question is whether countries can use regional trade agreements as an excuse not to respect the MFN rules on export restriction. For instance, in the, I remember that this issue was raised in one of the in cases at the WTO, but for instance in Turkey textile, where it was actually argued that this would violate WTO law. Yet it says the basis on which this the appellate body arrived, or the panel later on endorsed by the appellate body, arrived at the conclusion was the fact that the measure was not necessary for the formation of the customs union, but it says that it had not ruled on whether this measure can ever be justified as such. So I was just wondering whether, given the fact that the AfCFTA has not yet been implemented, whether it gives the opportunity for African countries, for instance, because they have somehow domesticated WTO rules on export restriction, to rather amend those rules and allow, for instance, instances where African countries can actually impose an export restriction on the outside world by excluding an African trade partners. So this is one of the issues I want to hear your thought on. Then it brings me to a second question regarding the fact that, and yeah, it links to the first one because of the WTO surveillance of preferential trade arrangements or preferential trade agreements. We all know that several regional trade agreements in Africa were notified at the WTO under the enabling clause since 1979. But before 1979, a lot of them were notified under Article 24, because of course the mechanism to notify under enabling clause did not exist at that time. But the critics of these notifications actually argue severally that going the enabling clause route has not helped African regional trade agreements to actually industrialize, because they relied on flexibility. They don't rely on the stricter rules on Article 24, which actually asks them to liberalize trade on substantially all the trade and all these kind of requirements. So my question is, do you believe that African countries who are actually, the AfCFTA members who are actually going for a deeper integration should go the enabling clause route or the Article 24 route? I understand basically that practically the battle for the enabling clause and other special and differential treatments it wasn't easy to win. And it would also be very difficult to sell the idea of giving it away. But again, if you are going for a deeper integration, can we suggest that African countries should notify under Article 24, which at least might force them to somehow give away the demons of lack of political will that we have seen jeopardizing other integration efforts on the continent? Now, other issues where, COVID and its impact on the operationalization of the AfCFTA agreement. I would like to hear your thought on the method that has been taking place for the negotiations of the remaining issues to have the agreement operationalized. Because of the COVID, member states were unable, the negotiators are unable to meet physically to negotiate for instance, the rules of origin that are needed for the protocol of trading goods to enter into force, or the schedule of commitments for the goods, or the tariff, or the schedule of commitment for services to actually have these agreements enter into force. Do you believe that the fact that they're having this negotiation online might affect the long-term implementation, or I would say in the future, could it be that instead we say, well, my commitments were recorded online, but it was not according to the procedures? Of course, I know that member have to negotiate in good faith, but again, we cannot predict what the future will hold if the procedures have changed in the course of the negotiation of the agreements. Could it be that in the future, instead we say, well, of course, I did commit online, but again, it was recorded in a way that was not properly that's not proper, or not the usual way of recording commitments. So yeah, this is one of the issues I have here. Yeah, last one, or maybe quarter to last. Penultimate one, I would say. Yeah, I would like to hear your view. Yeah, you mentioned South Africa here, and the fact that the developing countries have they see an agenda to reform the WTO. I want to hear your view on. I would like to hear your view, and maybe the audience's view on the fact that special and differential treatment, like I was mentioning earlier on the enabling clause, where somehow hardly won and fought to actually get the members to actually agree on this variable, the instances of countries actually integrating into the monetary system by using their own, by not abiding by the rules, the same rules at the same time. But again, what do you think of this United States, the move that the United States has taken to actually graduate countries from their developing country status? For instance, South Africa is now considered by the United States as a developed country for purposes of countervailing duties. Even though South Africa self-identifies as a developing country like the WTO, it has done so for Brazil for the same purposes, using the participation of South Africa in the G20 as a proxy for development. So, what do you think is how do you think it's going to fare well in the WTO, especially given the reform agenda that you actually mentioned earlier on? Thank you very much. And I have a couple of questions that I will probably address later on, depending on the reaction that we have from the public and also from Rob. Thanks.
Rob?
Okay, thanks very much. I think a bunch of useful observations and comments. I think I must say a kind of a general point to a number of remarks that Francisca made. I am no longer in the government. I'm an old age pensioner in a place called Velddrif, which gives me, I can say what I think should happen, but I can't say what the South African government will do now, or any of those things. I can just simply say what I think they should be doing, and I can say what the South African government did when I was there. That's as far as I can go. So let me say on the question raised about the fact that we need multilateralism more than ever doesn't mean that we're going to get it in a form that's going to be supportive anytime soon. So I don't think that that is the reality that we're going to go into, that we're going to have a decent multilateralism that's going to be supportive of more inclusive growth and development, unless the balance of forces begins to change politically in the light of COVID-19, which is a possibility. But at the moment, it looks like there are still many obstacles to be overcome before that happens. So that being the case, I want to say that, if we were to go along and say we are going to give way on the single undertaking issue, what is going to take its place? Is it going to be that we're going to be able to sit there with a majority of developing countries and say that we need an approach that is more susceptible to development, which is more in line with the Geneva principles? I suspect that's not what we're going to get. What we're going to get is we're going to get some idea that there are special majorities that can force through a number of the issues that are being championed by particular vested interests that are not necessarily in the common good of the majority of humanity. I think that's the reality that we're in. And so I think that my own view is that we need to support the idea of multilateralism and then embrace the idea of reform of multilateralism with an agenda that is shaped by what the needs and interests of the developing world are, not by we will lose multilateralism even more if we don't succumb to some of the partisan and patently unfair demands for reform that have been put on the table right now. That's my view of the matter. And I think that the digital trade issue, which of course you're right that it starts off with the e-commerce, but it's actually about digital trade. It's actually not even about digital trade, it's about digitization and the fourth industrial revolutions, all those issues that are there. And I think that what we've seen emerging over time, and this was a point that we always said, was we were in favor of there being a discussion within the WTO on this matter, open to all members, but not at the point of trying to draft rules, because the rules would have been shaped by what has already been put on the table in the mega regionals, particularly by the United States. And so as this issue is unfolded, we've seen, in fact, as far as I'm aware, there are 3 domains of approaches to digitization. The one which I suspect is the least available to any of us is the Chinese one, which is sometimes called the Great Firewall of China, which is block everything unless it suits us in the name of national security, and we'll build our own ICT industries behind that wall. And it's been highly successful in a certain way. But I suspect that that's the one that is least likely to be the one that's going to command any kind of multilateral rules. Then the EU, as I think you pointed out, has begun to depart quite significantly from the digital 2 more recently, in the light of, I think, things like digital companies aren't paying any taxes, in the light of there's massive abuse of data, not just for commercial purposes, but in political campaigns, and that there's a need to regulate on competition matters, there's a need to regulate on issues of privacy, on issues of data use, and all of that. And so, you know, you've got an evolving process there. What's not in that is about the policies required to address the digital divide and ensure that digital technologies are available to support their promise that they hold out to solve a whole range of developmental processes. And I think that actually South Africa is not necessarily the front runner on thinking on this. There's a country like Rwanda that's thought a lot more about digital sovereignty issues. India has got a very well thought through program of its own, which is beginning to address some of those issues. So I think it was absolutely correct. I don't know what the South African government's going to do now. I have no idea. But I think it was absolutely correct for us not to jump in to become part of forums that were going to develop a set of laws based on the digital 2 and just to find that a few months down the line, there were other thoughts, other considerations, and other ideas that need to come in. In other words, I think that there's a time for us to address issues of development and digital technologies before we even begin to start to draw up rules which I think were shaped by entrenching first mover advantage across the world. So I think that given the state of multilateralism and the expectations that I'm trying to say, I think are low at the moment for multilateralism, unless we have a bit of a change around the world, and it's possible. And it's possible that this does happen. But in that, you know, others have gone off and done their plurilateral. In a way, I think our plurilateral is the African Continental Free Trade Area. And that must be where we put our emphasis now. What we've got to do is we've got to build enough space for our African Continental Free Trade Area to begin to develop perspectives on some of these issues, including digital trade and the digital economy, that speaks to the realities of African countries, and on that basis come up with our positions and perspectives that we would take into other fora. So I think one of the really, really key questions is, if the way the WTO is at the moment, to get on to Regis's point, should we be seeking, and I know that this is a real issue in many of our regional organizations, in the SADC trade protocol, we have many, many instances of non-observation of the SADC trade protocol. Now, are we going to make the African Continental FTA work better because we have a tougher regime in the WTO? I don't think that's going to be the way it's going to work. I think the way it's going to work is that we have to structure the African Continental Free Trade Area that it actually does yield something concretely for everybody. If, you know, I mean, we've seen it from South Africa. If some country thinks that it's been, its industries are being disadvantaged by the entry of South African exports, and then they can point to the fact that we have a huge trade imbalance with that country, they impose things, and they can get the political support for us not to you know, be able to stop them doing it. And I think that speaks to that the trade arrangement, but built into a development arrangement, has actually got to yield something for everybody. If it doesn't, then you're going to get a proliferation of non-compliance, non-observation, and some of this will be in the form of maybe a rule and a regulation, but some of it will just be the customs officer just doesn't let the stuff in, that kind of stuff, which I think we've seen far too often. So I think that's the basis, and I think that we will explore many of these issues in the Continental FTA. If the Continental FTA can decisively break away from the temptation to see itself as simply being imitative of what's gone on in the EU, which is a very different environment, or following some prescription which is coming from outside parties, which I think are much less than unself-interested. Let me say also that the EU was able to revoke the rules, but I think that, you know, only when countries were reasonably satisfied that they weren't going to be too badly disadvantaged by this. This is the point I'm trying to make, is that these things survive as long as some country doesn't find itself in a deep crisis. I would have hoped, and let me now say I'm not in government. I wasn't in government when these regulations were in place. I can just say as a private citizen, I'm very glad to see that the regulations that were requiring permits for exports into SACU have given way to an exemption. I would have liked to have seen that for at least the whole of SADC, but even probably the whole of the continent. I would have liked to have seen that. I would have thought that would have been something that would have been in the spirit of what I'm trying to suggest, ought to be the approach to the continent. And then I think that, you know, special and differential treatment, as you say, is a hard one. I don't think that any trade agreement that's going to be supportive of anything other than mercantilism cannot have some elements of asymmetry and special and differential treatment built in. I don't think it can happen. And that the attempt to undermine it is not to find a model that's better for other developing countries. You know, in the Obama administration, they released a document on what should come after AGOA. And they had several options, but the real preference was for a TTP type agreement. And what was cited was a TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what was cited there was Vietnam. I mean, the irony of the United States holding up Vietnam, I mean, is you know, not lost on a few of us. But you know, I think that the realities of most countries in Africa is, if we reach an agreement of that sort with the United States, we will be gaining very little, and we will be giving quite a lot. And particularly on some of the trade-related matters, we will be giving away, for example, the possibilities of building generic pharmaceutical industries by some of the IP rules. We will be giving away the possibilities of finding a digital regulatory regime that supports development if we sign onto an agreement that entrenches the digital 2 dozen, as is the demand. And so I think that you know, this thing about the graduation and the criteria, the G20 replaced the G8 as the major body of global governance, not because it was supposed to be the same old developed world was going to find all the solutions, and we were in that club. It wasn't that. The idea was that you needed a few systemically significant economies that were not in the developed world also to be in the G20. That was the idea. India and you know, Indonesia and places like that were in there because they were seen to be systemically significant. And so now the idea that the G20 is a club of developed countries is absolute palpable nonsense. You know, it's a self-serving agenda to ensure that the United States, on its partisan interests, is able to advance its partisan interests and not to support any kind of development anywhere. And I do hope that we have the courage, and as an individual citizen, that we have the courage if it comes to it. And we have to make commitments like that to maintain the very small benefit we actually get from AGOA, rather than let it go and let's trade with the United States under MFN terms. That would be my preference, to be honest, as a private citizen, rather than to sign on to something like that and with all the implications they would have for policy space. And I hope that the continent can come together, because at one stage when the last AGOA forum I went to, Lighthizer came along, I might say significantly underprepared, and he faced a barrage led by the deputy chair of the AU Commission at that time, who said that we've got an agreement, we are not going to sign anything with you or negotiate anything with you as individual countries until the AfCFTA is in place. And then he could come back and say, that's what you say publicly, but privately some of you are saying something else. And I said, as the South African minister at the time, I say the same thing publicly and privately. I don't say anything different. And that if we can do that, I think that we can make more headway in the African continent. And I think we shouldn't forget these groups that were formed. On e-commerce wasn't the only one. But there were other things, investment facilitation and so on. I said, large groups of members come together around that. The largest, the issue that had the largest backing that wasn't tabled in the ministerial in Buenos Aires was from the G20, the G90 rather, the grouping of developing countries, on the clarification of the rules of special and differential treatment, because actually many of them are ambiguous and are not applicable to many cases. That was the biggest issue, but it's just sidelined. And other things that have got less support are championed and buttressed. So my last point, perhaps, to go back to what Francesca said. What about an African woman? Well, let me just also add to the list that the European Union candidate is also a woman. From the, I forgot her name now, but the Arantxa, who is now the foreign minister of Spain, but used to be Pascal Lamy's office head during his time. So, but the thing is that I sincerely hope that a woman doesn't take over a completely dead duck of an institution, which is what I think is becoming the reality. I sincerely hope that if whoever takes over would not be would be increasingly sensitive to the needs of promoting inclusivity and development. We used to have these private conversations that they used to be restricted to the members of the family. Why is it that populations across the world are turning away from trade? The first point I made was they mean free trade. Then the WTO used to come in and say, it's not trade that's causing the inequality. It's the fourth industrial revolution. And I said, well, it doesn't matter which one it is, but that's the reality. But we've got to find a solution to promoting greater inclusivity. I sincerely hope that whoever takes over could be supportive of such an agenda, but I'm not that hopeful. So I think that our hope lies in the continental FTA.
Okay, I think we've been at this for almost 2 hours, and I'm sure that people will get tired as well. So I don't think we should go on for much longer than at the most another half hour. So I'm now going to open it up for questions. Someone suggested to me that I should use the hand signal thing, but I don't see that on my device. So what I'm going to propose is that you indicate in the chat room if you've got a question. When I call on you, unmute, put your question, and then mute again if you can, to give Rob an opportunity to respond. Now, I've had 2 indications for questions. The first one is from Anthony, and the second is from Muchengeti. I hope that's the right pronunciation. So, Anthony, please. Well, maybe we've lost him. I can see him, Muchengeti. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. Thank you, Mr. Davies, for that presentation. It was very insightful. So I'd like to ask your opinion on the liberalization of the trade of legal services, which I think the South African legal profession engaged you in during your tenure at the DTI. The African Free Trade Agreement, the WTO agreement, and the General Agreement on the Trade of Services, GATS, all seem to lean towards a liberalization of services, including legal services. My understanding is that South Africa has made full liberalization commitments on the establishment of commercial presence by foreign law firms and therefore foreign lawyers. However, the licensing qualification deterred the full fulfillment of those obligations. More specifically, I'm referring to the licensing qualification of permanent residents. So non-citizen lawyers in South Africa need to acquire permanent residence before admission into the legal profession so they can practice fully. So my question then is, do you think that South Africa is meeting its commitments under GATS? And secondly, what position did yourself and the legal fraternity come to regarding the subject? Thanks.
Rob?
Okay. All right, let me, well, I was going to say, why don't you take a few of them and I'll answer them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bevan? Mr. Morris Makunyanzanzi? Ronnie? Mkwanazi? There's Ronnie.
Good afternoon, colleagues.
Go ahead.
Yes, that is Ronnie. Thank you very much for this insightful session. And I was actually confused for half an hour. I couldn't recognize the former minister there. I see he has rebranded himself. And congratulations on the book as well. I'm also a former part-time commissioner at ITech minister during your term. And for me, in fact, when I wrote my dissertation in 2001, it was on the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement system, and it was titled "A Perspective from Developing Countries." That was as a student at the University of Manchester. Now, Minister, for lack of a better title to you, I would just like to find out from you that regarding the recent developments surrounding the appellate body and the unavailability of that body, in fact, the non-appointment of that. I've seen that some countries have already started, following a route. Let's call it alternative dispute resolution, if you like. And I'm very keen to find out from you that, what would the lessons be insofar as the Africa Free Continental Agreement? What are the lessons learned from, the structure, the current dispute resolution structure of the World Trade Organization, and how can we then take those lessons and make sure that we avoid them insofar as the Africa Free Trade Continental area is involved? And I'll tell you why. I mean, it's quite obvious that at the WTO level, at least, there are obviously a lot of, political dynamics that come in play. You sitting there as an appellate body member, you represent the United States, and there's issues before you that you have to adjudicate on, and of course you'll be conflicted. So do you perhaps think that it's time perhaps to create independent, dispute settlement mechanisms, which is outside, in this instance, the WTO, and perhaps that be the lesson for the Africa, Continental Agreement? Thank you very much.
Okay, I also see that Amos has a question. Sorry, colleagues, I don't seem to see hands on my device, so I don't quite know why, but I think we'll manage the way I've suggested. So Amos, can you put your question?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Minister Rob Davies, and also the host, Firoz, for this very important symposium. I would like to encourage Dr. Davies to join us in academia and continue to teach. I am a professor of international economic law myself, so to have these great minds continue to teach the students, I think it is very important to do so. So off the record, I'm going to engage Rob about this, and if he denies, I'm going to report him to all of you that he has refused to take up some, especially to supervise masters and doctoral students. It's very important that we deal with these contemporary issues. But I just want to piggyback on what he continuously stated, that he's no longer part of government, so he does not know what's happening. So my question or my contribution is not necessarily to put him on the spot about it, but it's a general, at times it's a general observation when we do some work with African governments, the lack of continuity from one administration to another in terms of policy positions. It could be trade negotiations or other trade-related matters. That lack of continuity at times robs us of, maybe a good trajectory that was created before and the traction that was there. And then you have to restart with a new team because there's a change of administration. I think that having observed that in many African countries I worked with as a consultant, it's an issue that I thought I must put across to say, maybe we need to look at that. I'm sure he himself is still very influential. He's part of the ruling. He's part of the ruling party, as well as the tripartite alliance. So I'm sure he has got the ears on what is happening in the corridors government, and I'm sure to encourage that consistency and continuity is very important for us going forward. So that is my observation, which I will require to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions. I don't see any more, so I'm going to ask Rob to respond. You see, Rob?
Hello?
Yeah,
I'm more, I don't know if it's just me or what. I'm not hearing anything.
Can you hear me, Rob? I can see Ronnie, and I still see Francisca and Chengeti. Can you guys hear me? Francesca?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, I can hear
yeah,
you.
we can hear you.
I
Properly.
can hear you too. I can hear you
Myself,
too.
I can also hear you.
Rob, can you hear me?
I think he's disconnected, Prof, because it's not on
Yeah.
the list of people attending. Maybe you must just try to reconnect. Yeah. Thank you.
Magda, can you try reconnect him?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you.
Maybe, Chair, while he's away, the panel can try and still engage on the questions that have been raised by members.
Yes, thank you. I thought that's a good suggestion. Have we also lost Regis?
No, Regis is right there. I can see him next to my picture, but I mean, that would obviously be for everyone different.
I am here.
He's right there.
Okay. Oh, you were just on mute. Can we continue this conversation? I do want the questions that arise from the conversation for Rob to hear them. So, but perhaps we can have identify issues on which a response from him is not really required, but just arising from his presentation and his very specific perspective based on his experience, which I have to say, I'm as a non-trade specialist, so I'll make that disclosure. It seems to me absolutely correct that we should be looking to identify policy space. If in the years ahead, we're going to be pursuing a trade agenda which is linked to development. But that's just my own take. Is Rob? Have we got him yet?
I'm here, but I've missed a lot.
Okay, you haven't missed anything, Rob.
Okay.
Please go ahead and engage with the issues that have been raised. And once you've done that, I'll go back to Regis and Francesca. Let's see how the time goes, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Maybe he missed Amos's questions. I'm not sure he heard
it. I got as far as he was mentioning the issue of the lack of continuity in institutional memory. That's as far as I got with him.
Oh, okay.
Amos, do you have any additional questions?
I think he got mostly all of it. I think continuity, I spoke about it, but also to have him join the academic fraternity, you know, and because there's a lot that is going along in terms of empowering our students. If we really have to make an impact on the continent on trade matters. Thank you.
Okay. Is it me to respond now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. No. Thanks very much. As far as I was able to. So let me first of all the question about trade in legal services. Trade in services in the African Continental FTA is working on a positive list, and I don't think legal services is in it. I'm subject to correction on that, at least initially. It's things like tourism. I see Regis is also shaking his head, so I think it's not in the first instance. But I think the point that he's making is the general point about trading services issues at all levels. You have these modes: mode 1, mode 2, mode 3. Mode 4 is the one where citizens of the one country are able to move to another country to conduct services. That is always the one that becomes the biggest devil in any of these negotiations. And so you could have, you know, the right to establish a commercial presence, but not the lawyers can't come in, and that sort of thing without work permits and all that. I think that's going to be one of the biggest and toughest issues to come to terms with on this one. And maybe we need to start to embrace the reality that, you know, we construct many barriers because we think we're going to get swamped by low-skilled people who are going to take low-skilled jobs. But actually, they find a way to get here. And who we keep out are many of the skills that maybe could be quite useful to our economies. I'm kind of reminded of the fact that Silicon Valley, something like the majority of the people who are there don't come from the United States, and certainly don't come from California. So it's that sort of thing that you have, that kind of, but those issues are always the toughest issues. And I don't know how these things are going to be, are going to work their way through. There was also supposed to be, you know, parallel processes on free movement of business people and stuff like that. Those are always handled by Home Affairs and things like that. So I can't really say where those processes are at the moment. Then on the Ronnie's question on the dispute settlement. Yes, you're right, and also Francesca mentioned it, that several countries have gone into an arbitration arrangement. They've agreed that if the first phase they don't agree, then there's a compulsory arbitration process. But I think you can see that this is very much a sort of second guess. I mean, it just undermines the significance of rulings at the WTO. I think that Ronnie mentions a huge number of issues which were never part of the discussion from developing countries. So you had developed countries, the United States in particular. I mean, they were, as far as I understand it, the complaint they made was that the zeroing, which is a technical methodology of calculating for anti-dumping duties, was their procedure was not recognized by the WTO. But by and large, they win many issues. I did have an opportunity once to speak to somebody from India who was on the appellate body at one stage, and he was telling us the political pressure that's mounted on you about particular rulings and stuff like that, the political dynamics. It's not like, you know, witness tampering and stuff like that is applicable there. It's certainly not. So I think that's one of the things. But from the developing country point of view, there were the questions of cost and access. You know, in my time, we were very upset about some of the measures that were being taken against our citrus exports, and we were considering going to, you know, on that issue. But the question of cost, you know, there's a legal, I can't remember what it's called now, but there's an arrangement. We joined the thing. It's like the legal aid clinic for developing countries to go there. But the cost and the access, the difficulty, it's a process in which developing countries, the whole DSU process, in which developing countries are not particularly, it's not particularly friendly to developing countries taking up issues. That I think I should say. And so when the question of reform of the DSU process comes up, I do trust that developing countries will be able to put their own issues at stake. But as I indicated earlier on, it's not really about the DSU. It's about trying to force a different kind of reform into the WTO, which goes much further than that. So I would also say that we need to be a bit careful about looking at all sorts of other independent things and so on and so forth. I mean, there's another experience on investment treaties. The International Center of Settlement of Investment Disputes. This one, I think most people have come to a conclusion that this doesn't work particularly well either, and that many of the same issues or problems are there as well. So I think that in a way, when we get to it, I think we need to have a thorough consideration of access, of the way rulings are made, of, I think, trying to deal with some of these issues about the flagrant interventions into these judicial processes that have occurred and so on. And then on the question of, well, I'm not going to sit here and say what my future is going to be. I wrote that book precisely because I thought that it was important to try to get out fairly quickly the sort of historical memory of someone like myself, precisely because I'm aware about how quickly these things are lost. I mean, not so much in South Africa, but, you know, I was a minister for 10 years. And when I was at the beginning of my second term, I say I've been there about 6 or 7 years, people on the African continent started telling me I was the dean of ministers on the African continent. And I said, really? And then I thought about it and I looked, and at least of those who attend the sort of meetings, I was the longest serving. And then towards the end of my time, people start saying, you know, you're one of the longest serving in the world. And I looked again, and I thought, well, I am. And it tells you something. You know, there's a turnover of trade ministers, somebody comes in, the historical memory is not particularly strong, and I think it is important. And my mantra when I was a minister was that the role of a minister is to build an institution and not to build an ego. And it was about, you know, trying to embed some of those things in. That's why I wrote that. I have actually completed a manuscript of a longer book, which will come out next year. It's a longer sort of memoir, but more of a political economy of a whole lot of other issues in my time. So I do take these things seriously. And I do think that when I said that outcomes are about power, and I said there was something to do with institutional, that's the kind of thing I'm getting to, that you have institutions that have got long memories, people who serve, people who keep, you know, records and so on and so forth. I don't think we're as bad as all that in South Africa. I think we've got some very, very skilled people, and some of those have embedded training and skills development and so on into the institutions. But we could always do more. And so I think let me just leave it in.
Okay, I think I'm going to ask Francisca and Regis to make a closing comment. I don't see any other questions, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Okay, thank you, Feroz. One comment, I put that in the chat room, but the so-called legal aid from the WTO was mentioned, and I just wanted to highlight that one of its employees is actually in this meeting, Kolofelo, and it's called the Advisory Center for WTO Law. Second is to legal services, just one comment. There's also one in this meeting who writes a PhD on exactly that question with regards to legal services and Mode 4, specifically my PhD student. And there are obligations from South Africa with regards to Modes 4, and he will be very excited that that was part of the discussion. And the third point, just with regards to the e-commerce, because or digital trade rather, because that was a little bit longer. I didn't expect you to say what the South African government is doing now, because obviously you wouldn't, even if you know, you wouldn't say. But I do think that in the past to be not be part of the agreements was wise, for all the reasons you mentioned, but now maybe it has changed. And I think that is what I tried to say, that we have the AfCFTA as a forum for an option to do so, and the specific need now with the extreme digital divide, and maybe can address exactly at the AfCFTA level that digital divide problem within the agreement. And I'll leave it there as well. Thank you very much for the discussion. It was a very nice discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisca. Regis?
Okay. Yes. One comment I wanted to make was on the AfCFTA regarding the asymmetrical integration that was mentioned earlier on. I just wanted to highlight that the the AfCFTA negotiators, they actually did a good job by including implementation timeframe, by including special and differential treatment in the text, which actually takes into account the level of development of African countries in their and the ability to actually implement the agreement, and then the offer of technical assistance to members who are not able to implement the agreement at once. So I don't know how it's going to be put into. It's going to be operationalized. That this is there in the agreement, and also it just brings me to another observation I wanted to make on the fact that given the clash of paradigm that you mentioned in your own book as well, is it possible now that countries can, in the reform and also at the level of the reform in the WTO, is it possible to actually ignore the standards of special and differential treatment that was set during the negotiation of the trade facilitation agreement? Given in the sense that the members' ability to implement is linked to their to the ability to implement the agreement. So, is it possible now to forgo or to ignore that standard that has been set so far, given the U.S. desire and other developed country desire to graduate some countries from their developing country status? Yeah, this is one of the, and coming back to the AfCFTA and the US and other countries' desire to sign and to enter into agreements with African countries, I want to hear also your view on the fact that it will undermine, for instance, the MFN rule that has been put in the AfCFTA agreement, whereby countries decided to negotiate on as a continent, but countries are going behind and trying to sign deal with individual countries, undermining the MFN rule. And China has already done one. He has already entered in an agreement with Mauritius. So I wonder how it's going to set a path or set a precedent for other countries to actually follow the same route.
Rob, a quick kind of closing remark, perhaps, because Regis has opened up a question in a way. So do you have an immediate response? Because they...
Well, I mean, let me just say, I think that, Regis keeps raising quite a lot of quite important technical issues, but I think that the broader question, that the way the continent structures its relationships with the rest of the world, and whether this is shaped and informed by a development paradigm, a paradigm of, the sort of thinking around the need for policy space, and the Global Green New Deal, the Geneva Principles and all that. I think these are the critical questions. If we don't have the policy space to allow us to industrialize, and we give that away, and if we give it away, one of us gives it away, and then there's MFN within it, and we all try and do the same back again, we're going to incrementally, bit by bit, we're going to just undermine the sort of stance towards the rest of the world that I think we need to structure. So multilateralism is not going to yield us. I don't think we're going to get a developmental, as I said, multilateralism in the near future. We need to ensure that we don't have a multilateralism that becomes more of a complicating factor to the pursuit of development, because I think that this world after COVID-19 is a world where we either push forward on ambitious recovery programs that are actually going to solve some very deep-seated underdevelopment issues, or we're going to end up in a world which is even more unequal, even more fragmented, and even more not at peace with itself. So I think those are the two alternatives, and the Continental FTA, I think, has got to rise to that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I have a question for Magda quickly. Magda, these proceedings have been recorded, yes? And they can be made, they will be made available on our website?
Correct.
Great, because that's a response to a question. One quick closing comment or response, and before I thank everyone. See, I think that And our former minister has put his finger, identified an issue that is going to be central for South Africa and for our continent in the coming years. If we're not going to repeat the outcomes of the last 25 years of neoliberal globalization. So in this country, we're going to have to rise to the challenge of supporting the implementation of the African Free Trade Continental Agreement by doing focused research to support that process, and by building the capacity in South Africa and across the continent to negotiate in such a way that we preserve our space for developmental, a developmental inclusive economy agenda. It's as simple as that. So I hope that the trade specialists who've participated, those who are doing research, those who are in the academy, will use the book to frame the way they think about the research that we should be doing to support the developmental agenda, not only for South Africa, but for the continent. So I want to thank Dr. Davies for producing this book, for recording his thoughts, which are strategically important. They're not just a record of his experience in government. They do, it seems to me, provide a very clear path forward. Of course, there will be technical issues that we need to address, like the most favored nation principle and so forth. But I think we're also at a time, we're at a moment, I think Regis put his finger on it. It's a moment of inflection. It's a moment in which new paradigms are possible and necessary. So thanks very much to Rob for the book, for giving us your time. We look forward to engaging you in the future. Thanks very much to Dr. Suka, Professor, and also Dr. Simo from the Mandela Institute. He's in France at the moment on leave, on paternity leave rather. So thank you for finding the time. Please convey our regards to your president, Macron. And thank you everyone for participating. It's been a very interesting and challenging discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.